Just 15 minutes ago, if someone had told me that my wife May was having some kind of affair, I would have laughed. At that moment, just recently, I believed 100% in my wife's fidelity. In fact, I never even thought about any wrong scenario. But after what I had just heard, completely new emotions began to arise in me. Doubt, mistrust, and anger. It was a real accident. If I hadn't met Don Masters at SeaTac Airport, my world would have remained blissfully and strangely normal. But that didn't happen. The Masters lived next door to us in Bellevue when we first got married and moved into our new house. We bought our house and soon learned that Dawn and Carolyn Masters were our neighbors. They were 10 years older than us and had two school-aged children. Over the 2 years that they lived next door, we became friendly, although not quite friends. They eventually moved to Kirkland, and we mostly lost contact with them, except for the occasional Christmas card once a year or so. When I saw him at the baggage carousel, I immediately recognized Don and greeted him. We stood for a minute, gathering social balance. Don told me that he had returned from a business trip to California. I asked about Carolyn and the kids, and he said everything was fine, and that both boys were in high school. So, he began, "Are you single now?" "Lonely?" I asked in surprise. "No, May and I just celebrated our 6th anniversary. Why did you think I was lonely?" I saw a strange expression on his face. He looked at me, not knowing what to say. "Don, what?" I asked, reacting to his silence. "Listen," he began, "I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I saw May a few months ago in Los Angeles. It was an accident, just like this meeting." "So what?" I asked, still confused. "But why does that make you think we're not together?" He looked at me with a strange expression on his face. Finally, he answered. "Maybe it's nothing, but," he said, "I saw her in Ilmangair with her arms around some guy. I was there with clients, and they were at the bar. I knew that Me sometimes travels to Southern California, where Trans-Pacific Financial, her father's company, has an office. She was vice president of the Seattle branch. She flew there every month or two." "Are you sure it was May?" I asked, trying to figure out if this was a mistake. "Pretty sure it was her. In fact, as she walked by, we made eye contact and she kind of waved at me. It was definitely May." I thought for a moment. "Can you describe the guy?" I asked. "Yes, I got a good look at him. Asian. Tall, really very tall. Thin, dressed in a nice suit. He looked professional." I immediately knew who it was. David Chan. He also worked for TransPac. Chan was her father's golden boy. In fact, if everything had worked out according to her father's wishes, May would have been with him and not with me. I thought for a minute about her father, Long Pham. He never loved me. Although he never said it, the fact that May married me bothered him. It was ironic because May's mother seemed to love me. I continued to think after everything I heard. "Well, okay," Masters interrupted my thoughts. "Here's my luggage. I have to go." And with one last worried look on his face, he patted me on the shoulders and told me to take care of myself. After battling the usual terrible Puget Sound traffic, I finally made it home a little before 7 p.m. I entered the house and saw May with her phone, headphones on her head, walking around the living room. She smiled at me and waved her hand slightly, then pointed to the headphones. I was solving some business problems. My office was on the first floor near the entrance. I was a residential building contractor. I usually built 2 or 3 houses a year and made good money. I sat down at my desk and put aside the information from Don Masters for a moment. On my desk was a large map of a new community I was developing called Samish Meadows. This was definitely a bigger project than I had ever taken on. There were 40 sites. I had poured all my resources into this project and still needed help. To my surprise, the funding came from TransPac and May's father, Long Pham. I hoped that the business relationship would strengthen our personal relationship. That did not happen. Eventually, May ended the call. She kissed me when I entered the kitchen. She noticed my lack of enthusiasm in response to her kiss. "Bad day?" she asked. My thoughts were racing all the way home. Should I ignore what Masters said? Should we hire some detective to get the evidence? Or just ask her directly? Maybe there was some logical explanation. I sat down on the stool, turned, and looked at her. I chose the third option. I met Don Masters at SeaTac Airport, I said, and looked at her. She was holding up well, but I noticed a slight flash of panic on her face. May didn't answer. "So this is David Chan?" I asked. Again, she paused. Finally, overwhelmed, she took a deep breath and answered. "Devin," she told me, "it doesn't mean anything. David has been a family friend for a long time. I love you. You are my husband. Everything with David doesn't matter." I felt my heart starting to break. I looked at May. Beautiful, smart, she was fun to be with, and 90 minutes ago, I would have added reliable. It was hard to say now. "Devin, please," she begged. "This means nothing. I'm breaking up with David. Please, let's get through this. It does not matter." "I need to think," I answered her gloomily. "I'll sleep here tonight," nodding towards my office. "Devin, no. Please come to bed with me. Please," she begged. I met May at a party thrown by each other. She recently moved to Seattle from Southern California. I've always been attracted to women of her type. She was of mixed ethnicity. She later explained that her father was Vietnamese and her mother's family were French. Her father was in the financial business, and they were building a presence in the Puget Sound area. This brought her to Seattle. She opened a branch here. She complained about the weather, but also noted the beauty of the mountains and water. That evening, I invited her to my boat the next day. She agreed. We found a common language and soon began meeting regularly. I remember when I first met her parents. It was her mother's birthday, and her father asked May to fly to California to help celebrate. We met her father, Long, and her mother, Sophia, at the Capitol Grill. I was not told that my presence would be a surprise, at least for her father. When I introduced myself, I was met with a stony look and a limp hand. This greeting set the tone for our future relationship. He never loved me. I never knew if he thought I wasn't suitable for his daughter, or if it was because of our differences, or perhaps it was just a general dislike. I never fully knew this. When I asked her about his unfriendly attitude, May simply laughed. "It's just my dad." She smiled and told me, "He can be grumpy sometimes," she explained. I knew what grumpiness was, and that wasn't what I got from Long. I would rather call it hatred. We eventually got married, and although her father paid most of the wedding expenses, any act of kindness on his part was entirely focused on May. After our marriage, his attitude towards me did not change. Me's mother was always polite and treated me well, but there was no doubt who was dominant in the family. Long was in charge. Years later, when I had the opportunity to purchase the piece of land that would become Samish Meadows, financing came from Long and Trans-Pacific Financial. May suggested we talk to her father about the opportunity, and over the months as we finalized the deal, Long improved. We did have conversations about the project, and he seemed to become more accepting of me. This did not lead to a long-term rapprochement between us, but there was a slight warming. I was used to the nature of our relationship and tried not to let it bother me too much. I barely slept that night. It had nothing to do with the uncomfortable couch. One of the main pillars of our relationship was destroyed. Confidence. I tried to imagine forgiveness, and somehow I felt that I could muster up enough emotion to forgive her. What I didn't think I could get back was trust. I imagined my anxiety every time she went to California. Would I think she would end up in bed with David Chan or with someone else? Somehow, in my deep, swirling thoughts, I started blaming her father. I could imagine him trying to arrange for Chan to interfere in our marriage. One thing that hasn't changed is my trust in Long. I never trusted him. Finally, after a long night of tossing and turning, I decided not to make a decision right away. Divorce was certainly an option, but I wanted to see if I could forgive her and trust her again. Over the next few weeks, we tried to act like a married couple. We discussed her affair with Chan until I finally told her one night, "I don't want to talk about that guy anymore." It's been a stressful and unnatural few weeks. We made love several times, but the depth of affection we usually had was missing. I wasn't sure we were making any progress. One evening, she came home with a darker expression on her face. Tensions in our home, which were already high, increased. Finally, she told me what was going on. "I have to go to California next week. I will be there for 4 days," she said, lowering her eyes, not looking at me. I sat there processing and analyzing this news. "Will Chan be there?" I asked calmly. I looked at her. Still not looking at me, she nodded slightly, confirming his presence. Tensions in our home had, if possible, increased in the days leading up to her trip. She begged me to forgive her, and I rarely answered. It was becoming unbearable. The morning was quiet on the day of her departure. She insisted on taking Uber to the airport. I was happy. I wanted to avoid another hour of awkward conversation in the car. It was partly during her trip that I decided that we couldn't continue like this. As I went through all my options, I unfortunately realized that divorce was the only solution. My trust in her was completely destroyed. After some time of searching, I found a divorce lawyer. I wasn't looking for a bloodthirsty shark. I was just looking for a quiet and fair breakup. And in fact, with the prenuptial agreement her father insisted on, there was no doubt about the division of property. She returned that Thursday evening, and I placed the divorce papers on the dining room table. I told her we need to take them to the district court. She begged and cried and promised her love for me. I wasn't heartless, and there were times when I hugged her and apologized. "Devin, please," she said, tears running down her cheeks. "Let's not make a decision right away. Let's try a little. I think we can overcome this." The next day, I received a call I never expected to receive. It was her father, Long Pham. "My daughter May is not happy," he stated. "You need to leave everything as it is." He continued, "I need you to forget about the divorce. Make May happy." "Long, that is, Mr. Pham," I began, "this is a problem between May and me. I appreciate your concern, but this is something we need to work out together. I hope you understand." "Care," he almost screamed into the phone. "I don't care about you. I just need my daughter to be happy and my wife to be happy. For some reason I don't understand, she wants to stay married. I expect you to accept it." And without goodbye, the conversation ended. It was obvious that Long was used to getting his way. We had 2 or 3 more tearful conversations, but in the end, the trust issue was one I couldn't imagine overcoming. After our last conversation, she went to her room, and I thought I heard a long, muffled telephone conversation. I was pretty sure who she was talking to. By the weekend, we were discussing the practicalities of our failed marriage. Who will live where, and who will get which piece of furniture. Gone was the loving attitude that had symbolized our marriage just a few weeks ago. No, I saw a new side of May, and she seemed very much like her father. 2 weeks later, I found myself in a small apartment in Renton, May staying in the house. I was working on my development project. Once everything came together, I was going to make a lot of money. At least this was one positive event in my life, I thought. That morning, I received a call from the office of Maplewood Road and Paving, the contractor who paves roads in Samish Meadows. "We need the next payment," the accountant told me. I thought. There should have been automatic payment. Why was the payment not transferred? I told them there must have been a small mistake. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." I called the finance company and asked for an expedited payment for Maplewood. There was a pause, and I was put on hold. When the representative came online again, she directed me to a phone number in California. At that moment, I wasn't worried. I was just annoyed by all the running around. I called Trans-Pacific's California number. I asked about planned funding for my project. I was put on hold again, and then a few minutes later, a new voice came on the line. "David Chan, how can I help you?" "Chan." I froze for a minute without answering him. "Hello?" he asked. "Yes, this is Devin Baxter," I began. "I had a scheduled loan transfer that was not completed. I would like to see it expedited to pay the suppliers." "Devin," he began, "we've met a few times. Yes, let me take up your case." I heard him tapping on the keys as he looked through the files. Finally, he came online again. "Okay," he said slowly, as if reading a document. "Have you recently spoken to Long, Mr. Pham, about this matter?" I said I didn't talk and asked why. He told me that the loan was suspended, but no specific reasons were given. Only that Long Pham, my former father-in-law, stopped funding the project. When I asked if he was there, Chan said he was in Asia for a week and wasn't expected back until Monday next week. I quickly and quietly passed out. Something like panic spread through my chest. Will this bastard really do this to me? I sat down and thought. I invested everything I had into a piece of land that would become Samish Meadows. Almost $400,000. My loan from Transpac for the remainder was secured by land. I needed funding from Transpac to develop the land and turn it into cash flow. With the loan suspended, I could not move forward. I called May 3 times before she finally returned my call. "May," I began, "your father stopped funding the Samish Meadows project. I can't move on without it. I need your help," I said, trying to suppress despair and panic. She listened and said little. Finally, she said that she would talk to her father, but at the moment he was abroad. I tried to convey to her a sense of urgency about this issue. She seemed indifferent to my situation, as if she didn't care. This was the same woman who begged me not to get a divorce just a few weeks ago. I logged off and reviewed the original loan documents again. I still had an ownership interest in some of the land, but this property was not liquid. May's father had complete control over the entire development. I considered talking to another lender, but as I read in the agreement, Transpac had a majority stake and could delay the project as long as they wanted. I was a single person with extremely limited resources. How could I fight against a large global financial corporation with unlimited resources? After calling May several times, begging her to get my father to call me, I finally received a call from Long Pham on Friday afternoon. "Mr. Baxter, this is Long Pham. How can I help you?" he began. The formality of his greeting immediately put me on guard. I calmly discussed the Samish Meadows development situation, an agreed payment plan, and the need to continue the project to stay on schedule. After I outlined the logic of my request, there was a pause. Finally, he answered. "We are suspending all investment in residential property for now. We will postpone this and several other projects until the end of the year and review it then," he told me. Although he and I were never close, I was married to his daughter. I was treated with the same indifference as an ordinary stranger. I quickly began reviewing the numbers for Samish Meadows, finally asking what the problem was with continuing the loan. As I already explained, with irritation in my voice, we are suspending these loans for the near future. Unfortunately, I have another meeting that I have to go to. All the best," he said, and the phone went off. I tried to continue appealing through May, but after a while, she also stopped answering my calls. I considered legal action, but then thought about the practical nature of my current financial situation. I was worried about raising money for rent at the end of the month. I definitely didn't have money for a lawyer. I was really in a quandary, betrayed by May's father and my own misplaced trust in him. And trust, I thought, if May had not violated my trust, and we would have remained married, I have no doubt that my housing project would not have been put on hold. I'm not going to go into detail about the next 2 months. Let's just say I hit rock bottom. I turned to alcohol to numb the pain of my professional and financial failures, not to mention the failure of my marriage. Despite her infidelity, I still had feelings for May. On the other hand, she seemed capable of any emotion towards me. It's a skill I'm sure she inherited from her father. I tried to find a job in construction to at least avoid being evicted from my small apartment. My unstable mental state, coupled with excessive alcohol consumption, eliminated any job opportunities. I was on the edge. I borrowed from friends and relatives. My only asset, my interest in the Samish Meadows land, was entirely under the control of Transpac and Longa Fama. I was facing eviction next week. I sold my car and any other personal items that had even the slightest value. My boat was sold when I first raised funds for development. My thoughts turned to dark places as I contemplated my future. And then, out of the blue, that night I received a strange letter. It was from someone calling himself L. Kanakis. He owned a business called SSI. I read the rather long letter while drinking the last of the cheap whiskey. SSI was the parent company of some high-end health clubs on the Greek island of Santo in the Aegean Sea. As I understand it, they served wealthy clients. They offered exercise, yoga, pilates, and nutritional nutrition with healthy foods. In addition, there were classes on lifestyle, longevity, psychology, and a variety of personal enhancements. I did a quick search and found that it was a legitimate business. They had an impressive, professional website. I scrolled through photographs of beautiful whitewashed buildings, various classes, the impressive blue color of the sea, and the sunny areas of the complex. At the end of the letter, Kanakis indicated that he wanted to talk to me about the position of caretaker. Their current caretaker retires and returns to the mainland. I read the last sentence. If you're interested, I'd love to talk to you via Zoom tomorrow at 9:30 MPT. If you are not interested, please kindly decline the offer. And then there were instructions for the Zoom call. That's all. How did he know about me? Luckily, there wasn't enough alcohol to get me drunk. I looked out at the bleak climate of Western Washington in early spring, and then I went back to the Santos Spa website. It was like a fairyland. The comparison between the two environments was stark. My interest began to grow. I decided there was no harm in learning more about this opportunity. At this point, it was the only option I had. The next day at 9:30, I connected to Zoom with Mr. Leonidas Kanakis. "Good morning, Mr. Baxter," he began. By way of introduction, I am Leonidas Kanakis. His English was accented, as if he had studied somewhere in Western Europe. "Perhaps you have done some research on our complex in Santo. This is a very special place, and the demand for our services is high. Currently, there is a waiting list of 2 years. Because of all this activity, there is a constant need for repairs. This is where we need your skills." He continued to talk about the normal responsibilities that come with being a caretaker. He then talked a little more about the complex and touched on compensation issues. A small apartment and free access to dining facilities were part of the package. While listening to him, I noticed his charm and began to like him. He seemed pleasant and friendly. I could use some nice and friendly things going on in my life right now. "So," he began, "should I ask you about your level of interest in this proposal?" He caught me off guard, and I faltered in my response, saying that it all sounded interesting and that I needed to think about it. "Mr. Baxter," he said to me, his face suddenly serious, "Gus, my current caretaker, is leaving within the week. I need to find someone quickly. You are at the top of my list. But if it doesn't suit you, I have to move on to the next candidate." I thought about it. It really sounded wonderful, and I didn't really have many options. And nothing connected me here anymore. "No, Mr. Kanakis, I'm quite interested. It just came as a surprise to me." Okay, the charming smile suddenly appeared again. "I'll send you the contract today. It will contain all the details of your trip." He talked a little more and said we'd be in touch. At the very end of our conversation, I asked him a question. "Mr. Kanakis," I asked, "how did you know my name?" "Ah, Mr. Baxter, may I call you Devin?" he asked. "It's a long story. We can discuss it when you arrive." And with that, our Zoom call was over. 2 weeks later, I found myself on a British Airways flight to Athens. From Athens, I had to take a small plane to the east and then take a ferry to Santo Island. The package included a modest monthly salary, a small apartment, and access to the resort's dining facilities. Despite my relatively low income, I realized that I would have almost no expenses. Before leaving, I sent May a letter explaining that I was leaving the area and provided her with a post office box address in the small town of Marnasses where the ferry docked. Her answer was silence. This chapter of my life seems to be completely over. When I finally got off the ferry, I had been traveling for over 24 hours. We landed in a town called Parisses. Several boats with materials were unloading at the pier. I read that Santo Island has a small fishing industry, but the main source of income is tourism. Then I heard a horn from an open SUV. A large figure motioned me towards the parking lot. Mr. Devin Baxter, more of a statement than a question, from the big man behind the wheel of the car. I extended my hand for a handshake. He looked at my hand for a moment and then shook it lightly. "I'm Devin," I said kindly. "And you?" I asked. He hesitated and then said, "Emir." Still no heat. I studied Emir, a big man, 3 or 4 inches taller than my 6-foot height, and he must have weighed 250 pounds. Not much of it was fat. He appeared to be of Middle Eastern origin, possibly Turkish. He wasn't talkative, and we drove in silence for 20 minutes to the resort. The Santo Resort and Spa was terraced on a hillside, with a white sandy beach below in front of a calm blue-green sea. At the eastern end of the beach, there was a small pier and one boat. It was a Sea Ray cruiser. From the beach, the complex had 5 levels. The first one was where Emir dropped me off, and it looked like employee housing, the smallest. There were storage areas for equipment and supplies. There was a small workshop with various tools and equipment. My apartment was simple. One room with a small bathroom. There was a closet and not much else. I could tell this was once part of a smaller house of 2 or 3 rooms. The rooms outside my living space were neglected and in need of renovation. It seemed to be a random repository of unwanted junk. I soon learned that the second and third levels were where the guests were located and where most of the activities took place. The fourth level contained a cafeteria, classrooms, and several offices. The fifth and top level was the home of the owner Leonidas Kanakis. All the structures were painted bright white, which I imagined would require a lot of maintenance in the salty sea air. I received a message from Mr. Kanakis inviting me to dinner with him that evening at 9 o'clock. I spent the rest of the day exploring the complex, meeting a few people, and then getting some sleep before meeting up for dinner. Kanaki's house was the same white as the other buildings in Santos Spa, but there were more luxurious details evident in his home. I knocked on the front door and was silently greeted by the bulky Emir. I haven't seen a smile on his face yet. He led me to a side terrace, and under the arches a small table had been set for 2. The Emir nodded towards the table, and I took this as an invitation to sit down. Then the Emir retreated into the shadow of one of the arches. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stone terrace. It was a woman dressed mostly in black. She initially appeared to be around 50 years old, but could have been anywhere from mid-40s to early 60s. "I'm Lydia," she said, her hands clasped together, making no gesture of greeting. "I'm the assistant of Leonidas, Mr. Kanakis. He will join you soon." She had an accent, presumably Greek. It was difficult to call her attractive. She looked simple and businesslike. "Every day at 8 a.m. we will meet on the level below in the cafeteria. My office is at the end. You are expected to work until 6 p.m. daily. You have questions?" Before I could answer, I heard the sound of footsteps on the stone terrace. I recognized Kanakis from our Zoom call. His hand was extended, and there was a warm smile on his face. "Mr. Baxter, Devin," he corrected himself. "It's very nice to see that you made it to our Santo Island." With that, his arms spread out in a warm, all-encompassing gesture of greeting. "Ah," he sighed, "if you had seen Santo 10 years ago," he shook his head with a sad expression on his face, "you would have seen the real local environment, virtually unchanged for decades. It has become a tourist destination for Europe. Many changes." But he clapped his hands and his mood turned positive. "All this publicity around Santo is now very good for our business." He smiled and told me. I looked at him, tall, 2 or 3 inches taller than me. Thin, fit, and tanned. Mediterranean build. I directed it in the late 1940s. An attractive man with curly dark hair that is turning gray. We sat down and discussed my travels and review of Santo's Spa. The silent waitress brought us a delicious dinner and a bottle of chilled Santorini white wine. During the conversation, I got the slight impression that he was much less interested in what I was saying and much more interested in his dialogue. Finally, after a very pleasant dinner and mostly pleasant conversation, Kanakis suddenly stood up. Unfortunately, I will need to leave on business for a few days. If you have any questions, please contact Lydia. With a firm handshake on the shoulder, he turned and walked away, and I heard a door I hadn't seen open and close. For a moment, I just stood there. I eventually made it to my apartment and, jet-lagged, fell into a deep sleep. I woke up early, my body adjusting to the new time zone, and I met Lydia in the dining room. I noticed the guests. Although they were of all ages, most, I would guess, were over 50 years of age. They also looked rich. My observation was that Santos Spa was definitely in the luxury category. Today, Lydia was not as harsh as yesterday. We started with a tour of the complex. She then rattled off a long list of things that needed immediate attention. If you have questions and cannot reach me, please contact Grigos. I had met him before, and he seemed to be the head cleaner. A short, round, pleasant elderly man living in a village in Paris. One more thing, Mr. Baxter. Lydia suddenly became businesslike again. Don't get intimate with our guests. She said it with such an accent that it seemed like it had once been a problem. I nodded in agreement. Basically, the work that was entrusted to me was not technically difficult. It just seemed like there was an endless chain of things that needed some sort of repair. By the second month, I had settled into a rhythm. The work was not difficult. The weather was beautiful, and the surroundings were magnificent. I worked Monday through Friday and was on call on the weekends. The new environment helped me forget about my marriage and business disaster. The closest thing to a friend to me was the happy cleaner Grigos. He was very pleasant and always had a big smile on his face. If I had basic questions about how something worked at Santos Spa, I usually just turned to Grigos. Lydia was nice, but she made me feel uncomfortable. It was Friday, perhaps my 8th week on the island, and Grigos asked me about my plans for the weekend. I told him I don't know yet. Young men like you, he said, nodding to me. You will meet other people on the island. Go to Paris's tavern. Many people. Beautiful girl, he told me and laughed. I haven't started exploring outside of the resort yet, but I've been thinking about it. It was about a half-mile walk into town. It sounded interesting. On Friday evening, I took a walk and entered the tavern. It was almost full, seemingly 100% local residents. I saw Gina, one of the cleaning staff at the spa. She waved at me. Gina was sitting with a group of people who I would guess were in their 20s or 30s. She introduced me to everyone, calling out names that I didn't remember. She sat me down next to an attractive, curvy woman named Maria. Maria and I chatted in her broken English and my limited knowledge of a few Greek words. We had a few drinks over the course of a few hours, and I have to admit I had fun. I studied Maria, a curvy woman, not exactly athletic, but not overweight either. Wavy dark hair with something homey about the look. Not unattractive, just plain. As the evening continued, the conversation became increasingly personal between Maria and me. There were brief touches during the conversation. My thoughts began to move to next steps with Maria, whether it be tonight or in the future. I excused myself and went to the toilet. As I left the restroom, I glanced around at the crowd in the tavern. The room was filling, I noticed. I was almost back to where I was when I first saw her. I literally froze in place. Through my slightly intoxicated eyes, for a moment I thought it was May. The same dark hairstyle, the same slender figure, and then she turned. Not Asian features like May, something completely different, but just as attractive, if not more. Beautiful Mediterranean appearance, large dark eyes and full, sensual lips, younger Penelope Cruz, but slimmer. The striking resemblance to May from behind initially caught my attention, but her beauty froze me. Eventually, she noticed my paralyzed contemplation and looked at me. First with surprise, then with wariness, and then she turned back to the people she was with. I stood in the center of the tavern, motionless. Finally, a random jolt brought me back to reality. Still looking at her, I slowly walked over to my original table where Maria was sitting. I was almost ready to sit down, still glancing at the woman, when she turned to me and smiled slightly. Maria started talking and touching me a little, continuing the conversation we had before I went to the toilet. But I realized that I no longer have the energy for this. I looked at the warm, pleasant woman, Maria, and although she was not unattractive, she was physically no comparison to the woman I had seen. She may have sensed the change in my mood. In her defense, she tried. She leaned over, kissed me on the cheek, and whispered an invitation to take her home. Of course, I knew what it meant. And although my physical attraction was strong, I was not emotionally interested. I refused her as kindly as possible, and her mood changed from surprise to anger. I was sorry. Here was this sweet, ordinary girl offering herself to me, and I rejected her. Suddenly, she stood up. Several others stood up too, and everyone left. I received a sharp, angry look from Gina, my co-worker, on the way out. It was time for me to leave too, but I had an irresistible desire to meet the beautiful woman I saw. I stood up and looked around the tavern and saw her again with a small group of people at a table at the far end. Without a plan, I approached the group, looking at the woman. I walked over to their table, and for a moment their conversation continued, oblivious to my presence. Finally, a bearded man at the table, probably in his early 40s, 10 years older than me, noticed me and nodded. I nodded in response and extended my hand to the woman. She looked at my hand, then at me, and then took my hand for a moment. I introduced myself. "Hi, I'm Devin Baxter. I work at Santos Spa," I told her. "Gabriel," she answered quietly, her eyes meeting mine and then turning away. The bearded man moved over and offered me a chair, and I sat down. I received a smile from an older woman who I assumed was John's wife. The group continued the conversation they had been having before my intrusion, mostly in Greek. I sat there, just content to be in Gabrielle's presence for a moment. I tried not to look at her, but it was difficult. Several times she caught me and smiled. After a while, the tone of the conversation changed, and the group stood up. Not knowing what to do, I also stood up. The bearded man, John, raised his hand as if to say goodbye. Quickly, I moved closer to Gabrielle. "It was nice to meet you, Gabriel," I told her. She stopped and said, "Goodbye, Devin," she said, and turned to leave. "Gabriel," I said, and she turned, "Will you be here next week?" "Perhaps," she stopped and answered me, then walked away. That week at work, my thoughts were on the beautiful Gabrielle. As the week went on, I decided that I needed to find out more about her. Gina didn't talk to me anymore after I rejected her friend Maria, but I had another source. Grigos knew who I was talking about when I asked him about her. Her father, Tsufos, owns a grocery store on the mainland. He told me. Grigos told me that she brings fresh vegetables to the spa and the small village store. She usually comes once a week. He was not aware of her boyfriends or suitors. He said she delivers fruits and vegetables on Fridays, often stays overnight, and returns to the mainland on Saturday. That Friday night, I was at the tavern again, this time sitting at the bar. As a sign of friendship, I ordered drinks for Gina and Maria's table. I received several raised glasses and gestures of gratitude. No smiles, but no obvious hostility either. It was about 9 o'clock when I saw her again with John, the bearded man, his wife, and several others. As soon as they sat down, I sent drinks for this group too. When the waiter brought the drinks and spoke briefly with John, he turned to me, smiled, and waved for me to join. We sat down, and again the conversation around me was in a language that I did not understand very well. A little later, Gabrielle turned to me. "How do you like Santos Island?" she asked. We soon found ourselves in our own private conversation while the others chatted among themselves. I learned about the family's fruit and vegetable business, and Grigos told me that Friday was Gabriella's usual delivery day in Santos. I asked where she stayed in Santos on Fridays, and she gave me a non-committal answer. At one point, she stood up to use the restroom, and John turned to me. "Be careful around Gabriella," he said. I asked him to explain his warning, and all I got out of him was that she was fragile. I felt it, like a fine sculpture, beautiful but requiring careful handling. Once again, the group stood up to leave at the same time. I gently grabbed Gabriella's forearm. This surprised her, and she quickly inhaled at my touch. Then she turned to me with an expression somewhere between fear and surprise. "Can I walk you home?" I asked, not knowing where her home might be for the night. She nodded silently. John, his wife, and the others walked along the rocky path into the village. Gabriella and I walked slowly behind them. Part of the way I felt her small, warm hand squeeze mine. It was like an electric shock where we touched. I've heard of being struck by lightning, but always thought it was just melodrama. But no, it was real. I also felt that she felt it too. Slowly, my thumb stroked the top of her arm. Not aggressively, just feeling the connection between us. As we walked along the path in the faint moonlight, I felt like we were the only people on Earth. Eventually, John and Eve stopped at the door of one of the many cottages around the village. John turned and said something to Gabriella in Greek that I didn't understand. She answered briefly. John and Eve entered the cottage while the others continued on their way. The door was cracked open and Gabriella slowed, then stopped at the door. She turned to me and looked into my eyes. "Evharisto, Devon," she told me quietly, almost in a whisper, then leaned towards me and kissed me on the cheek. I couldn't resist. As she turned to enter the cottage, I put my arm around her and held her close. Our lips met and we kissed for a few minutes, and then she suddenly pulled away. She walked quickly to the cottage door, as if in a hurry. Surprised, I stood and watched as she entered. Did I offend her? Gone too far? But as soon as she closed the door, she turned and smiled at me, letting me know that everything was okay. I walked along the path back to my small apartment, lost in thought. Ever since May's accident, I haven't been particularly interested in any kind of relationship. The scars from my marriage and financial failure weighed heavily on me. But suddenly my feelings began to change. I felt positive about life. I began to stop questioning the path my life was taking. Of course, the magical island of Santos helped put out the fire of my divorce and financial ruin. But there was more to it than that. I knew it was too early to think about it, but I couldn't help myself. I was falling in love with Gabriella. These thoughts kept me awake until finally physical exhaustion forced me to sleep. The next day was Saturday, and I was somewhat surprised to find that I had an invitation to dinner with Leonidas Kanakis. The note read, 9 p.m. on the north veranda. I felt light on this sunny Saturday afternoon. The darkness of the last episodes of my life was receding. I felt positive and optimistic. I was looking forward to dinner with Kanakis, but what lifted my spirits the most was my growing friendship with Gabriella. With this new energy, I decided to explore. I started walking down to the small beach in front of the spa. Several guests were swimming, and I waved to them. After walking a short trail, I found the pier where Kanakis' boat was moored. It was a 40-foot Sea Ray. The boat accommodated a small group of people and was beautiful. I remembered my experiences with boats and the boats I had. I loved sailing and hoped to ride on that boat one day. I noticed he called it Hermes V. In front of the boat on the dock sat a beat-up Yamaha jet ski. He looked shabby. I have not seen such water transport on the water. Sometimes such things are prohibited. I inspected the boat and noticed that it needed a little maintenance. Not much, it just seemed like she wasn't being looked after as well as she should be. One thing was for sure, I thought as I studied the Hermes V, the trip back to the mainland would be much faster than the ferry. Beyond the jetty, past the jet ski, the beach became rocky, and I saw a small path that went inland, away from the water, through the bush. Following the path, it seemed that it ended. There was a drop of about 4 feet to a small piece of sand. I almost turned back around, but I saw some roots from twisted trees. I grabbed one, then the other, and jumped the last 2 feet onto the soft sand. Beyond this piece, it seemed, the trail continued. I followed a barely visible path and climbed over a rocky ledge. When I came out the other side, I was surprised at what I found. a beautiful crescent of sand, and beyond it, the deepest blue-green calm lagoon sea I have ever seen. It was like a beautiful little gem, and not a soul on the beach. So close, but hidden. I went down, took off my shoes, and rolled up my pants. The warm water felt refreshing on my bare feet. I turned my back to the sea and looked at the landscape. Because of the steep bank, I could only see the highest parts of Kanakis' house. The spa was not visible from this remote bay. Tired, I took off my shirt and sat down on the fine white sand. The heat and exertion made me drowsy, and I fell into a light sleep. I finally got up and quickly scanned the area. Seeing no one, I took off the rest of my clothes and dived into the clear water. Something about the water on my skin was simply sensual. The feeling was indescribable. I felt weightless, as if small hands were holding me afloat effortlessly. I enjoyed the water and the feeling of floating in the sea. I finally got out, dried off in the warm sun, got dressed, and headed back. I felt the urge to tell someone about my discovery of this pirate bay, but after thinking about it, I selfishly decided to keep it a secret. As I walked, I knew I wanted to share this discovery with someone, and it didn't take me long to figure out who. With Gabriella. That night, I arrived at Kanakis' house a little before 9 o'clock. Under the arch, I saw the emir standing quietly in the shadows. I greeted him good-naturedly, and in response received a short nod without expression on his sullen face. Kanakis, on the other hand, crossed the stone floor with a smile and great energy. "Devon, my friend," he greeted me, grabbing my outstretched hands in his. "Welcome, welcome. How are you finding life on Santos?" he asked enthusiastically. I explained that everything was fine and that I was enjoying the experience. He nodded vigorously. Happy man, satisfied with life. I told him that I saw his Hermes V boat today and complimented it. "Are you familiar with boats?" he asked. I told him I had, and he asked if I had ever worked on boats. I said that I had been sailing since childhood, and until recently I had my own boat. Then he added that he did all the maintenance on his boats himself. "I'm having trouble with my Hermes engine," he said. "Would you mind taking a look at this?" he asked. I said I'd be happy to take a look at it the next day. At that moment, the same silent waitress brought our dinner dishes, and we ate in silence for several minutes. "I have a deep respect for the water, the beautiful Mediterranean Sea," Kanakis said, looking out at the magnificent view. Then he told me a story. Many years ago, he was on a small boat, returning to the mainland alone. The boat began to take on water, and Kanakis was eventually forced to abandon it and use a small inflatable boat when the boat sank. "Devon," he told me, "I don't know how many days I was adrift at sea. All the water I had quickly ran out, and I had no food. The sun was merciless, slowly boiling me alive. I never knew such pain." He said that at one point the torment he endured was too much. "I was ready to jump overboard and end my life by plunging into the sea. I told myself I wanted to see one last sunset before I died. As I looked west to see the beauty of the end of my last day, I couldn't believe my eyes. The ship was coming straight towards me. I tried to scream to get their attention, but I had no voice. It didn't matter. They saw me and saved me. I was so grateful. But Devon," he said, looking into my eyes, I realized at that moment that I was no longer afraid of death, and realized that at some point in our lives, there comes a time when death becomes preferable to the suffering of life." I sat pondering his story and his thoughts on death and life. I wondered what the point of this story was. Eventually, the evening took its course, and we drank ouzo quietly and calmly at the end of our dinner. Again, throughout the evening, I had the impression that no matter what I said, no matter how much I participated in the conversation, his interest in what I said was minimal. "Have a nice evening, my friend," stated Kanakis. "One thing is true." He continued with a more serious expression. "I have learned that you have met Gabriella Tsufos, the daughter of my good friend Ambrosis Tsufos." I nodded silently, wondering how he knew about this. "Please, as a friend," he told me seriously, "be careful with her. She is a beautiful but inexperienced young woman. There are things you don't know about her. I wouldn't want Gabriella to get hurt. I sat at the table thinking about it. Things I don't know. Which things? Several questions to Kanakis on this topic came to mind. But before I could ask anything, he stood up, wished me good night, and with the same energy with which he entered, quickly left. I continued to sit, immersed in the strange evening, and perhaps would have sat longer, but I saw the huge shadow of the emir moving towards the veranda where I was sitting. The message was quite clear: time to leave. The next day, Sunday, Lydia brought me the keys to Kanakis' boat, the Hermes V. Along with the keys were maintenance instructions. I was surprised and a little unhappy. Now it seemed my job included maintaining his boat. I thought about the strange but not unpleasant evening with Kanakis, the story of his survival at sea, and then comments about Gabriella. How did he know about my friendship, if that's what you can call it at this stage, with her? I didn't know Kanakis very well, but I began to form an opinion. These thoughts were running through my head as I approached his boat, the Hermes V. I had it inspected, and as I noted earlier, it was in need of some light maintenance. I have compiled a list of required parts and materials. I inspected the engine, and it also needed general maintenance. I checked the cooling system. Internal wiring was showing signs of wear. I also noticed early signs of heat damage on the engine. No wonder the boat performed poorly. It was a fire trap waiting to happen. I took the Hermes for a short ride and felt the mechanical problem Kanakis was trying to describe. Returning to the dock, I examined the engine again. Definitely overheated. I determined what parts would be needed to fix the heating problem. Later, I gave Lydia my order list from the mainland. As I left, I remembered that I forgot to tell her to limit her use of Hermes until the renovations were completed. Well, I thought, they don't seem to use the boat much. Everything should be fine. The week went by quickly again. I had an endless to-do list. Lydia prioritized projects by importance. One thing that changed was that I was now expected to service the Hermes V2. On Tuesday morning, one of my tasks was to polish the brass on the boat. Suddenly, Friday came. I was looking forward to meeting Gabriella at the tavern. This was the highlight of my week. My wariness and negative attitude towards the opposite sex disappeared thanks to the time spent with Gabriella. But there was more to it than that. The months following my divorce from May felt like a dark cloak, dragging me down into a negative hole. I trusted May, and then she betrayed me with David Chan. And to make matters worse, her father betrayed me in our business agreement. I had reasons to be negative. And suddenly I met Gabriella. Like a bright light, our brief interactions pulled me out of this dark hole. I asked myself, am I getting ahead of myself? After all, I've only seen her a few times. Calm down, I told myself. But then I remembered our kiss at the cottage door. I felt something, and I know she felt it too. I freshened up after work on Friday and arrived at the tavern earlier than usual. I was in a good mood, happy, and it seemed that others were too. Even Maria, whom I had rejected a few weeks ago, smiled at me and waved. Like clockwork, John, Eve, and a couple of others entered the tavern with Gabriella. I saw her look around the tavern, then saw me, smiled, and walked over to where I was sitting at the bar. "Devon," she said, and kissed me on the cheek. I felt the electricity again as her lips touched mine. "Come, sit down with me." I was warmly welcomed into the group when we sat down. At first, it was general conversation, but eventually Gabriella and I focused on our conversation. As it got late, the tavern became noisy. "It's getting a little hard to talk. Do you want to go for a walk?" I asked Gabriella. Immediately, she looked at me with an almost worried expression. Before answering, she leaned towards Eve, raised her hand to her ear, and began a short conversation. Eve listened, then raised her hand and whispered something back to Gabriella. I saw Gabriella nod as Eve spoke. At some point, her eyes flickered to me. Finally, their private conversation ended and Gabriella stood up. Looks like I passed some kind of test. Funny, I thought, Gabriella must be at least 25 years old. Why did she seem to need permission to walk with me? We walked along the rocky path back to Santos Spa. I thought it would be too early to invite her to my small apartment. Moreover, my modest home was far from impressive. We ended up on Santos Beach. It was dark, and I saw several guests enjoying the moonlight and the sea. Gabriella squeezed my hand, and her touch still had that sensual, magical effect that I had never experienced. I wanted to show her the secret cove I found, but it would be too difficult to navigate at night. We walked to the end of the beach, where a rocky ledge turned into a pier where Hermes V was moored. We turned, and I hugged Gabriella. She turned to me. I held her close. I felt the warm swells of her breasts pressed against my chest, and I kissed her. It was the same feeling I had the first time. I don't know how long we stood in a dark corner of the beach, kissing. Our bodies were pressed closely together. I was completely aroused, and although we weren't rubbing, there was a feeling of rhythm where our bodies were touching. I couldn't feel the bra when I rubbed her back. With one hand, I caressed her breasts through her thin shirt. "We should go back," she said, lowering her eyes in embarrassment. "Gabriella," I said, and she looked up. "It's okay. I care about you. You're important to me. I'll be patient with you. It's just," I told her, "you're so beautiful. I want you." This brought a smile to her face. "Devin," she paused and said to me quietly as we walked back along the beach, "I want you too." She looked at me again, turned and kissed me on the cheek, and laughed. I remembered my first school experiences, mishandling the mysteries of sex and the female body. But there were also new emotional experiences associated with the physical ones. It felt the same. To use a nautical analogy, I was steering a ship into unknown waters with Gabriella. Of course, from the point of view of sexual experience, these things were not new to me. I was married. But because of Gabriella's innocence, I felt as if I too was going through these experiences all over again. Part of the way back, I asked her about Kanakis. How well does she know him, and what does she think of him? "I've known Leon all my life," she said. "He has been doing business with our family for many years. He employs many people in Santos and does a lot of good for the islanders who live here." I digested her words. What Gabriella said matched what I observed, but the questions I really wanted answered, I didn't know how to ask her. What did Kanakis mean when he said, "There are things you don't know about Gabriella"? Did he tell you about the masquerade? She asked, smiling. I told her no. "I haven't heard of a masquerade. What is it?" I asked. She told me it was a big annual party at Kanakis' house. Masquerade. She explained a little more and said that he would be there soon. As we approached the tavern, I stopped just before we entered. "Gabriella," I began, "next week, can you spend all day with me on Saturday?" "I would like to," she said and smiled at me. "I'll ask Dad." At that moment, John, Eve, and the others left the tavern. Gabriella turned and gave me a warm but brief kiss on my lips. "Goodbye, Devin," she whispered to me. "See you next week." My thoughts that week revolved around meeting Gabriella and spending the day with her the following Saturday. Meanwhile, I carried out my regular duties maintaining the Santos Spa. On Wednesday, Lydia brought me the parts I ordered for the Hermes V. I spent the entire day replacing the fuel regulator in the engine bay. I removed the old one and saw signs of erosion on it. It was dangerous to the point that it could cause a fire. After 2 hours of trying to install the new harness, I came to the conclusion that Lydia ordered the wrong part. I posted a warning sign indicating that use should be restricted until the repairs were completed. This was what I always did when working on boats. Now there was no regulator on the fuel line. I tried to explain this to Lydia, then gave her the exact name of the part to order. On Friday evening, I went to the tavern. I arrived a little early, hoping that Gabriella would arrive earlier than usual. She wasn't there, but that wasn't unusual. Usually he and John, Eva, and that group came after 8. By 9:30, my curiosity about their absence had turned to disappointment tinged with anger. At 10, I left and went to the village of Parasies. I wasn't exactly sure which cottage was John and Eve's home where I walked Gabriella one day. I felt stupid knocking on the door at this time of night, especially since I wasn't sure if I was at the right place. I knocked quietly. Silence. I tried again. There was no answer. I stood there, not knowing what to do next. I soon realized that I really had no choice. The way home was full of thoughts about my disappointment and desire to see Gabriella. Did something happen? Was there any logical explanation? Why didn't she contact me? I came to the conclusion that she could not contact me for the same reason that I did not contact her. We didn't have each other's phone numbers. I decided that in the morning I would go back to Paris's and try to find John and Eve. I'll then ask for Gabriella's contact information. Okay, I thought, at least I have a plan. On Saturday morning, I walked along the trail to Paris's. I wandered through the small town center and past the cluster of cottages where I thought John and Eva lived. I even went to a small grocery store. I wondered if their vegetable delivery was late. But no, the vegetables looked fresh. As I was about to leave, suddenly I heard a voice calling me. It was Grigos, the cleaner from the Santos spa. We talked, and as always, Grigos was happy, with a big smile on his face. We spent a few minutes discussing the weather, work, and a few general topics. Finally, I brought up the topic of Gabriella. You know Gabriella Tsufos, I began, the woman who delivers fruits and vegetables. He studied me for a moment, processing my question. Yes, a very beautiful girl, he said. The smile became wider. Have you seen her recently? I asked. Grigos paused, his eyes darting skyward, his thumb and forefinger stroking his chin in thought as he processed my question. Suddenly, he snapped his fingers and said, Nai, saw her yesterday. Where? I asked him with a sense of urgency in my voice. He told me that he saw Gabriella walking up the steps to Kanakis' house on Friday afternoon. I guess I was working on the boat and didn't notice it. I asked Grigos a few follow-up questions, but he didn't know any other details. I thanked him and headed back to the spa. On the way, I decided to try to talk to Kanakis. My excuse was that I wanted to inform him about the condition of Hermes V, and then I would find a way to mention Gabriella. I walked past guests doing yoga, stretching, calisthenics, then past the dining area and up the stairs to the top floor where Kanakis lived. I felt a little awkward arriving here uninvited, but I needed to find out about Gabriella. I knocked on the door. There was no answer. I knocked again. I stood in silence, waiting, and was about to leave when the door suddenly opened. It was Emir. If anything, his aggressively negative expression became even more obvious. I asked to speak with Kanakis. Without answering, he closed the door almost with a bang. I stood there, not knowing if he understood what I asked. He didn't say anything. A few minutes later, the door opened again, Emir again. With a gloomy face, he nodded towards the veranda and pointed to a small table overlooking the sea. I sat down, waiting. And I waited. It must have been about 30 minutes before Kanakis appeared. With the same energy and smile, but the expression on his face was not as warm as in previous meetings. After minimal greetings, he spoke. Devon, he began, what do you want to discuss today? Saturday? He asked. I started telling him about the problems with the Hermes V and what I was doing to fix them. He seemed bored, impatient, looking at the phone several times, clearly uninterested in the details. I was almost sure that he understood almost nothing I said. This is all? He asked, his good-natured expression visibly weakening. I nodded. In the future, he began, such issues can be resolved with Lydia. He said this and stood up. I got up too. One more thing, I said as he turned around. I was curious if you've seen Gabriella in the last day or two. He stared at me. For a full minute, he looked at me without saying a word. Not an iota of friendliness on his face. I already told you, she is fragile and inexperienced. Please remember that, he said and quickly left. He never answered my question, and I almost followed Kanakis into the house. But before I did, I saw Emir watching me, ready for action. Reluctantly, I turned and walked back to my room, angry and confused. My joyful mood of the past weeks has disappeared. I had let my feelings get out of control with thoughts of Gabriella, and now I was unsure of her feelings. She said she wanted me, but I wondered what happened to her last week. The fact that Grigos saw her near Kanakis' house proved that she was on the island. On Tuesday, I had two projects on the boat. The first was to oil the main deck and then wash the life jacket covers. While I was oiling the deck, Kanakis appeared out of nowhere. "Devon," he greeted me, with a smiling face. "The Hermes looks great, almost like new," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "Just remember," I began, "I still have to replace the regulator harness." He nodded, half listening to what I was saying. "Devon, one more thing," he said, changing the subject. "There's a masquerade coming up at the spa. We want the grounds to be in tip-top shape for the event. Lydia will keep you posted." I nodded as he started to walk away. "And Devon, of course, my friend, without a doubt, your presence is required," he said, smiling. "I think you'll enjoy our annual masquerade." The rest of the week passed slowly with daily routines. I often used my construction skills to fix things, but sometimes I felt like I was a glorified janitor. Today was one of those days when I was taking life jackets to the laundry. Finally, Friday came. I really needed to see Gabriella and wondered if I would be disappointed again. By 8 o'clock, I was at the tavern. It's too early for her to arrive. Once again, I sent drinks to Maria, Gina, and their friends. It seems that hostile feelings have begun to subside. And then suddenly Gabriella was alone next to me. No John, no Eve, just her with a worried expression on her face. She ordered a glass of wine. "Devon, I'm so sorry about last week," she said with urgency. "I really tried to come and wanted to spend Saturday with you. I'm sorry." She held my forearm, and the electric sensation of her touch was as strong as ever. I was glad she was here, but I felt like I deserved some kind of explanation about her whereabouts last Friday. I asked her what happened. I knew she was in Santos, but Grigos saw her. Where was she? What was she doing? "Oh, Devon," she began, "let's not talk about this right now. I'm just so glad we're together." And she tightened her grip on my forearm. And then, before I could ask any more questions, she finished her wine and stood up. "Devon, let's go outside and take a walk." It was light, and the temperature was still warm, around 80 degrees. Our route took us away from Paris's and back to the spa. We reached the spa beach, and Gabriella took off her sandals and walked into the warm, ankle-deep sea. "Oh, Devon, the water feels so good," she said, smiling. I was glad to see her happy. The evening was simply wonderful. There were several spa guests on the beach enjoying the setting, and then a thought came to me. Yes, it's still light enough, I thought. "Come on," I told her. "Put on your sandals." "Where?" she began. I grabbed her hand and we climbed over the ledge. We then followed a rarely used path to a point where we had to jump down onto the sand and then jump over a rock barrier again. "Where are we going?" she asked. I simply told her what she would see soon and led her down the path. Having climbed over the last barrier, we found ourselves in place. Secret little cove. The sun was already setting, but there was still enough light to enjoy the beauty of the surroundings. I looked at Gabriella, and she was smiling. She hugged me, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "Devon, it's so beautiful here," she exclaimed. We walked to the water, and again Gabriella took off her sandals and walked into the water. "The water here," she began, "it feels different, warmer, but not only. I can't explain. The sea here is simply amazing." These were the same feelings I had when I first discovered this bay. We were alone on the beach, the light was fading, but the warmth of the day was still felt. Without thinking, I took off my shirt, kicked off my shoes, and took off my pants. In my underwear, I ran into the sea and dived. It was the same magical feeling, sensual and refreshing. I swam and enjoyed the feeling. I turned towards the beach and was surprised and happy at what I saw. Gabriella, completely naked, walked into the sea. Her beauty took my breath away. "You are looking at me," she said, smiling and pretending to cover herself. Silently, I approached her. The sight of her made me completely aroused. The material of my underwear stretched. As the water became shallow, my sexual arousal became apparent. Gabriella's eyes flickered down and saw my condition. We hugged in knee-deep water, her body pressed tightly against mine. We swam and swam, enjoying the sensation. Gabriella then turned away from the shore and, with fast, strong strokes, quickly found herself in the depths. I was amazed at how fast she swam. "Wow," I said when she returned. She laughed and told me she was on her town's swim team. I was third place at the national competition. She said proudly. I was impressed. Slowly but surely, I began to get to know Gabriella better. After some time, we left the water. The warm air felt pleasant on our bare skin. I turned and kissed her, and she pressed herself against me. Our bodies pressed tightly against each other. She began to tremble, but not because of the air temperature. My lips touched her neck, and I heard her gasp at the sensation. I took off my underwear. We started making love, and suddenly she gasped as if she had woken up. "Devon, no," she exclaimed, breaking free, breaking our contact. She hurriedly got up and began to quickly get dressed. "Gabriella, what happened?" I asked. I saw silent tears on her cheeks. She simply shook her head, not saying a word as she continued to get dressed. I stood nearby, naked, not understanding what happened. 1 minute we were making love, and the next she suddenly stopped sex and seemed upset. Finally, slowly, I started to get dressed. "Do you want to go back?" I asked her quietly, and she nodded in response. We walked out of the small cove in silence, up the path and back to the spa beach. Halfway to the tavern, her hand found mine. I looked at her, but her eyes were downcast. We were already on our way to the tavern when I said I was sorry. She didn't answer. I told her that I hoped she didn't feel like I was forcing her into something that made her feel uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke. "Devon," she began, "I care about you, but I'm scared." She said almost in a whisper, "I'm not used to," and fell silent, offering no other explanation. As we walked, I felt like I understood her unexpressed feelings. I knew that she lived a sheltered life. I heard about it from Kanakis and others. She is a beautiful woman who has probably attracted men in her life. She may have had unwanted experiences that made her wary. I believed that she had feelings for me, but her sexual inexperience was something I had to approach slowly. Although my desire for her was strong, I was willing to sacrifice my physical desire for a more important emotional connection. Eventually, we arrived at the tavern. Gabriella turned to me. "I have to go. I'll find John and Eve," she said. "But I will see you soon," she said softly. Then she hugged me and kissed me deeply. I held her close, not wanting to let her go. Slowly, she pulled away, gave me a shy smile, and entered the tavern. Although I was not physically satisfied, I believed that Gabriella and I had crossed an emotional threshold. This young, beautiful, inexperienced girl shared her naked body with me. I wanted it to be longer and fuller, but I also felt like I understood her better now, and it satisfied me in a different way. There was only one thing that bothered me. She never explained what happened the previous weekend. With these thoughts in mind, I carried out my duties at the Santos Spa for a week. My concentration levels were mixed, and on several occasions Lydia had to speak more forcefully to me to get my attention. "I said," Lydia repeated, "that the parts for the boat will be on the ferry. Also, the masquerade party will be in a week on Saturday. We have a lot of work to do before that," she said. Friday night, I was eager to see Gabriella. I was at the tavern a little after 8. It was crowded there. Even in the short time I was on Santos, I noticed a growing influx of European tourists, many of whom were buying and decorating small cottages all over the island. At about 9 o'clock, I saw Gabriella, John, and Eve entering the tavern. They sat down and settled down. I stood up to join them. It wasn't until I was at their table that Gabriella or one of them acknowledged me. I greeted the group and John gave me his seat. This was not the greeting I expected. Over the past week, Gabriella and I have had physical and emotional intimacy in our relationship. I didn't feel the same closeness today, at least not yet. She smiled at me and was definitely friendly, but nothing felt intimate. We talked about everyday things, and one of the topics was the masquerade party. Everyone seemed excited and looking forward to this event. I didn't pay much attention to the party talk. I was really looking forward to some alone time with Gabriella. In a quiet moment, I suggested she go for a walk. I said it quietly, but Eva heard me. She said something to Gabriella quickly and quietly in Greek. I didn't understand. Instead of answering, she put her hand on mine. I felt that electricity again from her touch. She held her hand there for a moment, patted my hand twice, and then removed it. Something was wrong that night, I just didn't know what. They eventually stood up as a group to leave. I told Gabriella that I would accompany her. She smiled at me reassuringly and took my hand. We walked behind the others, and some of the intimacy we had experienced last week returned. All too quickly, we arrived at the door of John and Eve's house. Gabriella turned to me and gave me a warm kiss on my lips. As I hugged her tighter, she gave me another quick kiss and hurried inside. "See you at the masquerade," she said, standing in the doorway. "It's going to be an exciting night." She gave me one last smile and then disappeared into the cottage. I was confused when I returned home. There were moments when our connection was obvious, but I never felt the full closeness that we experienced last week. I decided to be more direct in this relationship, starting with this masquerade that everyone talks about so much. It's been a busy week. Lydia had a long to-do list throughout the spa. I noticed a large truck with several workers outside Kanaki's house, probably preparing and decorating it for a party. Leonid asked that the boat be repaired by the weekend. Lydia told me, "I'll bring you the materials this afternoon." When did I become a marine mechanic? I thought with irritation. The guy certainly had enough money to bring a mechanic from the mainland. Well, okay, I thought. I'll get to the boat soon enough along with a long list of other things I need to do. By late afternoon, I had finally completed most of my tasks and was upside down in the Hermes V-engine bay trying to install the regulator. This turned out to be more difficult than I initially thought. Installation was easy, but the part that needed to be installed was in an awkward location. I heard someone walking on the deck of the boat while I was lying in the compartment, and I heard my name called. It was Grigos, who was looking for me. "Devon," he began, "there's a message for you from the mainland. It's in your apartment." What, I thought? I wonder what this is about. I decided to take a break from working on the engine and deal with this unexpected message. When I returned to my apartment, I saw a document taped to my door. It must have come by ferry, and then someone delivered it in person. Strange, I thought. It's a lot of effort. I read the document. It was from DHL Air Express. It stated that I had a registered letter delivered to a post office box that I had been instructed to create on the Greek mainland at Manassas. I read the brief document, and it did not provide any information about what the letter was or who sent it. As I sat in my small kitchen, trying to understand this strange document, Grigos looked in on me. "All the laundry is done," he smiled and told me, "Lydia is looking for you too." Wash? What kind of laundry, I thought. And then I remembered covers for life jackets. I had to take them to Hermes at some point, I thought. One more thing that needed to be done. I left my apartment and saw Lydia almost running towards me. "Devon," she began, slightly out of breath. "There's a leak in the women's shower outside the yoga studio on the second floor. It's an emergency." I turned and walked into the building next to mine, which I had set up as a workshop. I grabbed my tool belt, some extra wrenches, and some caulk. Lydia led me to a plumbing problem. It turned out that the repair was quite simple, but time-consuming. I had to turn off the main water valve to work on the leak. As soon as I saw the problem, I fixed it and then rebuilt the tile wall, which had to be dismantled to gain access. The only positive thing was that 3 women who did not notice the out-of-service sign entered the shower room naked. I got a pretty good look at some nice breasts. By the time I finished, it was starting to get dark. I met with Lydia. The masquerade was tomorrow, and we still had a lot to do before the event. Lydia and I prioritized projects. They were all on the 3rd floor, where guests were supposed to pass through. Although I was exhausted, I went to the tavern that night, hoping to see Gabrielle. There were times when I felt happy and confident in our growing relationship. but there were other times when her mysterious behavior made me doubt her true feelings. I sat down at the bar and waved to Maria, Gina, and their friends. Gabriel, Eve, and John have not arrived yet. I knew I needed to go to bed early. There's a lot to do tomorrow before the big party. I was still hoping to see Gabrielle. A little after 9 o'clock, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I quickly turned around, thinking it would be Gabriel. No, it was Eve. "Devin," she smiled and greeted me. I looked around, expecting to see Gabrielle next to her, but she was alone. "Gabrielle couldn't come tonight, but she wanted to give you a message." I was disappointed, but I hid my feelings. I simply nodded to Eve, wanting to hear Gabrielle's message. "She wants to make sure you're at the masquerade tomorrow night," Eva told me. "She told you to look for her. She will be in a red fox costume." Eva then smiled, nodded once, gave me a brief hug, and left. I sat there with mixed feelings, excited by the message from Gabrielle and the thought of spending a lot of time with her at the party. But I was also confused. Why did Eve have to deliver the message? Still getting mixed signals from her, and it was starting to irritate me with the whole masquerade business. Everyone seemed too concerned about it. And of course, Lydia was stressing me out with all this preparation for the big party. And should I have worn a suit? The closest thing I had was a welding helmet. Later, while walking home, one of my issues was resolved. There was a cardboard box tied with rope on my doorstep. My name was printed on the box in black ink. Returning inside, I opened it. It was a suit of purple satin with a black mask, like Zorro's, covering his eyes and nose. There was also some kind of cap with ends and bells. This all seemed a little strange to me, but I was exhausted and had a big day tomorrow before the event. I didn't spend much time thinking about the costume. The next day, Saturday, Lydia and I got together and made a list of projects that needed to be completed. There was a lot of activity at the spa with various vendors preparing for the big event. Finally, around 5 o'clock in the evening, Lydia announced that we were done for the day. "Go home, rest, but be here by 7 o'clock. Leonid will be performing at this time," she told me. I took a shower and took a nap. Shortly before 7 o'clock, I began to put on my suit. It looked ridiculous, but it seemed to suit me. Large puffy sleeves and wide legs, a black mask and cap with many sharp points and a bell on each. I'd seen something like this in books, I thought, but didn't know what the costume was supposed to represent. There were many people in elaborate costumes at the event. On the third level, food and several bars were installed. There were also waiters passing glasses of wine and champagne on trays around the crowd. I took one. A stream of people walked up and down the wide stone steps to Kanaki's house on the 4th level. I've dined there a few times, but never ventured far into the estate. I was curious. But most of all, I was looking for Gabrielle. Red fox costume. I was looking for something similar to this. I also looked around the crowd to see her long dark hair. And then Kanakis, dressed as a bright red devil, began his speech. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Welcome to my home. I'm so glad to see so many friends and neighbors here for our annual event. I am your host, but I also take responsibility for more than just the duties of the host today. I am the custodian of this property," and he spread his arms in a generalizing gesture. "It is not mine. At the moment I live here, but one day there will be other people here in my place. I thank you all for the opportunity to be with such a person. Number of people and be your master. Tonight will be a night of excitement and mystery. Enjoy the masquerade." He spoke again with an open gesture of his hands, inviting the guests to experience the evening. Suddenly, the noise level seemed to increase. There was talk and laughter all around. Thirsty, I took another wine from the waiter. I stood among the crowd, scanning the figures for a petite woman in a fox costume. I saw a familiar long stream of dark hair. It should be her, but no, they were wearing some kind of green suit with a cape. Not a red fox. Standing in the main hall, looking out over the crowd of masked guests, I was beginning to get frustrated. All I really wanted was to find Gabrielle, and so far I had failed. I probably also drank too much. I told myself I needed to slow down. Suddenly, I felt a tug behind the large, bloated sleeve of my ridiculous suit. I turned around, and there she was, beautiful in a reddish-orange tight suit, the same eye mask as mine, but bright red, and finally, two pointed ears. She smiled at me, her mouth open. I couldn't resist. I kissed her, lips to lips. A deep kiss expressing my longing for her, and she responded with equal enthusiasm. "Oh, Devon," she smiled and told me, "I love your costume. You're a joke. How appropriate." I barely heard her. I was so engrossed just looking at her. I chuckled and nodded and looked down at her suit, like I said it was tight. I realized she wasn't wearing a bra. I was trying to think of a way to be alone with her somewhere on the property. While I was thinking this over, she grabbed my hand. "Come on, Devon," she almost shouted to me over the noise of the costumed guests. We walked to an area where a 70s rock band was playing. People were dancing, and that was what Gabrielle wanted to do too. They played 3 fast songs and then a slow one. During the slow dance, we were pressed against each other. "Let's get a drink," she whispered in my ear, and we found one of the many bars. "Here, try this." The bartenders gave us wide-mouth glasses, almost like cans. I felt the alcohol was cold. I thought it was white wine. I took a big greedy sip and immediately started coughing. Gabriel and the bartender started laughing. "What is this?" I asked. It was similar to wine, but with a much stronger taste, almost like turpentine. Gabrielle explained that it was a Greek drink called retsina. It is a wine fortified with pine resin and is popular throughout the Greek islands. After a while, I started to like it. Its coolness was refreshing, and the more I drank, the less harsh it seemed. But I started to get a little drunk. I drank 2 or 3 wines before meeting Gabrielle, and now I'm retsina. I had to be careful. We walked among the people at the party, Gabrielle holding my hand tightly. I felt her soft, exposed breasts against me, and the feeling kept me aroused. Finally, I saw a dark corner behind the dance floor and stage. I began to maneuver Gabrielle in that direction. When we got to the dance floor, she insisted on dancing. My moves on the dance floor, never good, were now getting worse due to my alcohol consumption. I probably looked ridiculous, staggering around in that stupid costume, trying to dance. Eventually, a slow song began. I pressed her closer to me, and the friction intensified. I whispered to her that we needed to find a place to be alone. "Where?" she asked. "Follow me," I told her. Unfortunately, we passed by a retsina bar, and the bartender, with Gabrielle's encouragement, poured us another cold glass of this strong drink. Finally, we left the bar and walked in the shade to the secluded area I had noticed earlier. I had to be really careful. I was on the verge of intoxication. But I was so happy to be with Gabrielle that my intoxication and the party atmosphere took me to another level of consciousness. We slipped around the corner to an abandoned area outside the party. I kissed her, and she answered me. I started to remove her mask, and she objected. "No, please leave her. This is a masquerade." She smiled and said. We continued to kiss. Her hand reached down and stroked me through the surface of the velvet suit. I vaguely remembered putting on that stupid suit. It was a series of zippers and fasteners. Trying to get naked so close to a party didn't seem like a good idea, even in my nearly drunk and sexually aroused state. Finally, Gabrielle took a step back. "Devon, later, we'll have time later." "But I want you now," I told her urgently. "Sometimes in life, we don't always get what we want when we want it." She said, adding, "This is one of the lessons of life." With a sigh, I accepted the situation, knowing that we would be together at the end of the evening. We joined a large group in the central courtyard where the entertainment was taking place. On a small stage, a magician performed various tricks. In one corner, it looked like there was a fortune teller. Next was a juggler in a clown costume. At some point, Gabrielle whispered to me that she would be back soon. A few minutes later, a rough hand wrapped around my shoulders. I was almost knocked off my feet in my weakened state. It was Kanaki's. "Devon, my good man," it thundered. How are you? Are you enjoying yourself? How do you like our masquerade? He asked me these questions quickly, without expecting answers. Come on, my friend, I want to show you something, he told me. When I protested weakly, not wanting to leave Gabrielle, he told me we wouldn't be gone long. I agreed. In fact, I was curious what he wanted to show me. Kanakis, holding me by the elbow, led me inside a large villa. There were people in suits in the spacious entrance, but as we went deeper into the estate, the number of people decreased. We came to a wide door with wooden beams. Two young men stood on either side of the door, muscular and bare-chested, with metal cylinders on their wrists. Each one held, oddly enough, a spear. Even in my intoxicated state, it seemed like a ridiculous affectation. A blank expression on their faces, full of seriousness. They were either security or part of the party decorations. Kanakis smiled and opened the door. Immediately beyond were stone steps that descended steeply into the lower level of the building. At the bottom of the stairs was another wooden door that opened into a medium-sized room with several rows of chairs facing a wide theater curtain. The air in the underground room was slightly cooler. Kanakis invited me to sit directly in front of the center of the curtain. He motioned for me to sit down, and as soon as I did, an attractive dark-skinned young woman dressed as Cleopatra brought out a silver tray with glasses and an unlabeled bottle of greenish-clear liquid. Devon, Kanakis began, acting as the good-natured host. I want to share a few things with you. This is my little gallery. And with these words, the curtain parted, revealing a stage, but a dark one. I couldn't make out the objects behind the curtain. I heard people coming in behind me, and they filled the rows of chairs. But first, a toast to the evening. Kanakis poured 2 small glasses of liquor that the young woman had brought. He handed me one, raised his glass, and drank it down. He winced as he swallowed it, and then looked at me. I knew I was on the verge of intoxication, but his hospitality was hard to refuse. I drank it. Despite my intoxication, my senses become sharper. I turned to Kanakis to ask him what it was, but found that I could not speak. Okay, yes, my friend. It's a liqueur made from wormwood. It's called absinthe, but we also call it green fairy. It was hard to describe why, but I thoroughly enjoyed the effect of the green fairy. Now, Devon, the show begins. I heard a faint rustling behind me and looked back to see 2 bare-chested guards behind me. At that moment, a spotlight illuminated the sculpture on the stage in front of me. It was a classic female nude. The head was missing and one of the arms was broken off. Kanakis told me that it was made in the 7th century by a Greek sculptor named Papadakalias. Soon several more valuable works of art were shown on stage. I've never been a big fan of art, but somehow, perhaps because of the absinthe, I was captivated by the show. Then the curtain closed and the tail lights came on. One more toast, my host suggested, and we both drank more green fairy. Gradually, the curtain opened again. I felt movement on stage, but in the darkness, I could not understand what was happening. The drink made me hyper-attentive and alert, while at the same time giving me a pleasant physical lethargy. Soon, the figures on the stage began to slowly appear. It became clear that they had sex. The woman receiving sex was a dark-skinned girl who brought us absinthe. Gradually, the background light slowly illuminated more of the space. There were people lined up in the background of the stage. They were in various states of costume or undress. Even in my inebriated state, I was fascinated by the live sex, watching the lights brighten the people in the background. Look, Devon, I heard Kanakis say. I watched, and I watched a small group of people watching a couple copulate. Suddenly, I saw Gabrielle, no longer in her fancy dress, standing with the group. She was wearing a sheer, almost see-through nightgown, the stage lights illuminating her body. Visually, she was naked. I started to stand up and felt Kanakis' strong grip on my forearm. I also noticed 2 muscular guards with spears flanking me. I had no choice but to sit and watch the show. I tried to make eye contact with Gabrielle to somehow communicate with her. What's happened? Was she forced to be here? I wanted to protect her. Of course, her inexperience with sex would be shocked by this spectacle. She looked at me, her expression blank. The pleasant intoxication from absinthe had now disappeared. I was worried about Gabrielle's safety. I felt my heart speed up. I looked at her, trying to somehow reach her, and suddenly one side of her shirt came unfastened, revealing her bare chest, the same breast that I caressed not more than an hour ago. And then a hand came up to grab her. I looked at the person next to her, caressing her. To my shock, I recognized him. It was a disgusting Emir. And suddenly, I saw a small smile on her face, as if encouraging his caresses. I couldn't believe that my beautiful, innocent Gabrielle was the same person I saw on stage. It was obscene. Suddenly, the lights on the stage went out and the curtain closed. I tried to get up, but all my strength left me. One more act, Devon, and this little show will be over. More green fairy. Kanakis poured us both a glass, and for some reason I drank it. I then tried to get up, walk away, and find Gabrielle. But as soon as I stood up, both guards walked towards me, holding sharp spears threateningly. You better stay seated for the final part, Kanakis told me calmly. What options did I have? We were sitting in the dark, and I heard more people entering the dark room. I must have lost consciousness for a moment. No wonder. The combination of wine, Retsina, and the green fairy would intoxicate anyone. Absinthe alone would be enough. I was brought to my senses by a friendly slap on the back from Kanakis. Devon, he began in his usual magnanimous tone. Pay attention, you don't want to miss the final act. I opened my eyes and saw the same dark curtain slowly opening. At first, I only saw shadows, but gradually the strategic lights began to light up. And then I saw her. Gabrielle was no more than a dozen feet in front of me. At first, I saw only her face, illuminated, looking at me without emotion. She continued to look at me while sex was happening. Her face was emotionless. There were none of the emotions we shared less than an hour ago. Why did this happen? What was going on? This whole scene must have required some unusual planning. And how were they able to convince Gabrielle to participate in sex? My drunken brain couldn't find a single logical thought to understand what I was seeing. The light then dimmed and the curtain closed, and for a moment I sat in complete incomprehension. My world as I knew it changed dramatically. Another drink, Devon, suggested Kanakis, my friendly host. I don't know why, but I accepted his offer. Perhaps if I prolonged my intoxication, the pain of what I saw would be temporarily numbed. I was sitting in a semi-conscious state, wondering what would happen next, and suddenly the curtain opened and the light illuminated the entire stage. The participants were sitting there on chairs. And now it is time to meet the participants of today's performance. Kanakis stood up and addressed me, and the others behind me. Through the fog in my head, I heard Kanakis introducing each of the players in this ridiculous performance. At first, there were two bodyguards with naked torsos. I turned my head left and right to make sure I was no longer a prisoner. And then there was Isis, a dark-skinned woman. Her partner was a smiling guy named Marcelo. He introduced several others, including the bulky Emir. My attention was weakening, the alcohol was taking its toll. And of course, you know the star of our show, Gabrielle Tsufas. Kanakis unnecessarily introduced her with a smile. Then Gabrielle, in her sheer robe, stood up without embarrassment, smiled at me and those behind us, and bowed to the audience. There was a playful smile on her face. Oh, and Devon, I have one more surprise, two actually. And then Kanakis turned to the people on stage and gestured to the figure in the wolf costume to his right. The wolf took a few steps forward, towards the center of the stage. And with these words, he took off the head part of the suit. When I saw who it was, I literally shook my head in disbelief. It was impossible. If you've ever met someone in a completely unexpected place, you know how confusing it can be. Multiply those feelings by 100. That's what I experienced. It couldn't be who it turned out to be, the one who had just had sex with Gabrielle. It was my former father-in-law Long Pham. I tried to get up, but fell into a group of chairs. The combination of panic and complete intoxication made it impossible for me to stay on my feet. Devon, please sit down," Kanakis told me with false goodwill. There are a few things I need to explain to you. Here, take a deep breath, no more green fairy for you. He then laughed. You see, Devon, Long is an old friend of mine. I made my money in the financial sector in Southeast Asia. Long and I have known each other for many years. As you may know, Long is completely devoted to his family, especially his daughter, your ex-wife, May. At that moment, Kanakis nodded towards the back of the stage, and there stood a familiar figure in a green suit with long dark hair. It was May. May, my ex-wife, watched me at my lowest point, embarrassed and confused. At least May had the decency to look away from my tragic humiliation. And when you decided to divorce Long's daughter, it upset him greatly. He was unhappy that you, an outsider, disrupted the harmony in his family. Long felt it necessary to teach you a lesson. You upset me greatly, and it affected their entire family. Long knew that I often put on our little shows here, so to speak, and asked for my help. I gladly offered my help and attracted the charming Gabrielle. An amateur actress, Gabrielle was ready to help. Gabrielle stood up again and curtsied. She had a big smile on her face. So, Devon, you became part of the fun too. Maybe you were wondering about your costume. You wore it well. You, my friend, are a buffoon. With your clumsy attempts at seduction, Gabrielle and I had a lot of laughs at your expense. The show is over for today. The masquerade is over. I only have one piece of advice for you, Devon. There are times in life when we realize that we do not control our destiny. At this moment, it is best to accept our fate and not waste energy on something that should not have happened. Kanakis then stood up, and the movement of others, as well as the participants in the performance, began. The show is over. Devon, please don't rush to leave. It's a steep road to your place. With these words, he left. Darkness, severe pain in the head, confusion. Where am I? Slowly, very slowly, consciousness penetrated my brain. Through half-opened eyes, I discovered that I was in my small apartment in the spa. I moved carefully, my head was throbbing, and there was pain behind my eyes. My stomach didn't feel good either. I turned over and something hard pressed into my back. This was the least of my inconveniences at this moment. Gradually, but surprisingly clearly, I began to remember the events of the previous night. The first thing in my mind was the image of my ex-father-in-law with Gabrielle. And then, and I almost snapped out of this thought, the look in her eyes when sex brought her pleasure. For a moment, I was taken back to our nightly skinny dip on that secluded beach. Is it possible that they could have been spying on me this whole time? My head was spinning from incomprehension. Various images and thoughts popped into my mind like knife blades, wounding me psychologically. I replayed the evening in my head with what seemed like normal night-out activities with a girl. And then Gabrielle said she'd be back soon, and Kanakis pulled me in. Everything seemed normal with Gabrielle. And now, realizing that this was all some kind of vindictive prank, I felt like an idiot. I fell back onto my bed. I've never felt so bad. It was worse than when I lost Samish Meadows. I lay there, immersed in my shattered worldview. I began to doubt many things in my life. Suddenly, a wave of fatigue washed over me, and I collapsed onto the mattress again. The hard object I had noticed earlier was now pressing into my back again. I turned on my side and reached out to remove the object. And then I saw him. What was that doing in my bed? I carefully picked it up and examined it. It was a pistol. A revolver, to be precise. I knew enough about pistols to understand this. I could see that it was loaded. But how did he get here? Or perhaps a better question, why is he here? I lay on the bed, still in my ridiculous jester costume, thinking about the turn my life had taken. And then I looked at the gun. It would be a quick and easy solution to get rid of the pain and humiliation. And then I remembered dinner with Kanakis shortly after my arrival in Santo. I remembered his story about how he got lost at sea, and I remember what he told me. This is probably not verbatim, but close enough. I realized at that moment that I was not afraid of death, and I thought that at some point in life, death becomes preferable to life itself. I thought about my life, all my grand plans, my failed marriage to the man I really loved, my failure in business, and then my new love with Gabrielle. Obviously, this was some kind of crazy mass prank, and I was a fool. I looked at the gun. I lay there for a while, thinking, was death preferable to life for me? It would be painless and would save so much suffering. In the midst of these thoughts, I heard a noise outside. It froze me. Something was wrong in my foggy brain, but it took a few minutes to figure out what it was. The noise I heard was the sound of a boat being launched, and just from the sound I knew it was a Hermes V. I warned Lydia and Kanakis that the boat was not ready for use, and in fact it would be dangerous even over a short distance. Slowly I stood up, my head throbbing. I hesitantly approached the window. It was far away, but I saw them. 4. Kanakis, Long Pham, my ex-wife May, and finally Gabriel. It was clear what was happening. Long probably didn't want to wait for the ferry. After he achieved his final revenge at my expense, he returned to reality. He needed to get back to running Trans-Pacific. May and Gabriel were also in a hurry to leave Santo. I quickly walked towards the door, or at least as quickly as I could in my current state. I should have warned them. But then I stopped. What was my obligation? I already warned Kanakis about the problem, and then I thought about those people on the boat. What do I owe them? I imagined myself walking down the dock dressed as a jester, screaming and waving my arms as they laughed at me and sailed off to the mainland. This thought froze me. I stood looking out the window, my moral compass conflicting with my anger at all 4 of them. And then the boat accelerated, moving away from the pier. I stood there with the same moral question. Could I have stopped them? Did I want to stop them? I looked around the small apartment, and the first thing I did was throw out the ridiculous suit. Maybe I was still a fool, but at least I wasn't dressed like that anymore. I looked at the bed, and there was a gun. He pointed at me obscenely. I went to the bed, opened the drum, and poured out the bullets. Then I opened the door and threw the gun into the water. I heard a splash. I had a thought. I remembered that I had seen a case with binoculars in a nearby workshop. I stumbled towards it and found binoculars in an old brown leather case. I went outside to a high place with a small view of the sea. I stared at the water. At first, I didn't see anything. It is possible that Hermes V could reach the mainland without problems, but in reality, this was unlikely. I was about to go back and rummage through my things for some aspirin when I saw this. This would not be visible without binoculars, but here it is. A little puff of smoke, black smoke, and maybe I saw a flash of flame. My instincts took over, suppressing other emotions. I knew that the unpredictable and small Greek Coast Guard would not be the answer to this problem on Sunday morning. I remembered another disturbing thing. There were no life jackets on the boat. They were in the laundry room. This thought pushed me into action. I had to do something. I looked around and suddenly remembered a potential solution. Jet ski. Does it work? Can he reach them? With my help, could we put out the fire? I ran, as far as possible in my condition, to the pier. I checked. The jet ski had a full tank. The keys were in the ignition. I tried to start it, and it shook and died. I played with it a bit and tried again. This time it ran a little longer, but did not start. I pulled a few more levers and tried again. This time he started. I untied the jet ski and, with binoculars around my neck, headed towards the smoke. Several times I had to stop and use my binoculars to get back on course. The rough seas made my nausea worse, but didn't slow me down. I had the idea that I would get to Hermes, and the 5 of us would put out the fire. I'd stay with them on the jet ski while they wait for a tow from the Coast Guard. For a moment, the anger and desire for revenge receded. These people needed help. But this did not happen. I was now within sight of Hermes. Everything was worse than I expected. Visible flames engulfed the back of the boat. The fire extinguisher was near the engine compartment. They had no way to get it. I saw May and Long clinging to the high side of the boat. Kanakis sat on the tilted bow. Gabrielle was next to Hermes, keeping her afloat. The only thing that kept the whole boat from catching fire was that the burning rear part was submerged in the water. As soon as they saw me, everyone started waving. I quickly assessed the situation. There was no chance of saving the boat or using it as a flotation device for four. The mechanically unpredictable jet ski could accommodate a maximum of 2 people, and I was not so noble or stupid as to sacrifice myself for any of them. Now we had a moral choice. Which of the 4 should we save? "Devon, help!" they all shouted. Right away, Long was the loudest and most assertive. "You must save me. We will send help to others. I demand it," Long shouted. I noticed that May was silently looking at her father as he commanded my help. It didn't take much analysis to realize that he had just sentenced his daughter to death to save himself. "Devon, my friend, I need your help here," Kanakis shouted to me. "Please, I'm begging," he added, his voice shaking. The boat tilted and May's grip on the side broke. Now she was floating next to the boat. "Please," Gabrielle told me quietly. She looked at me with her beautiful eyes, eyes that I loved. I hesitated. Just a day ago, I would have given my life to save Gabrielle. And suddenly, the image of her having sex with a wolf, long femme in a suit, surfaced in my brain. With a quick dash, I reached May, reached out, and pulled her onto the jet ski. Kanakis broke down and began to beg me to leave May and take him to the rescue. I saw him desperately clinging to the nose of Hermes and thought about how he had manipulated me for his own pleasure. "You know, Kanakis," I said, "someone once gave me advice that went something like this. There are times in life when we realize that we are not in control of our destiny. In these moments, it's best to accept your fate and not waste energy on something that shouldn't have happened." With that, I quickly turned around and sped back towards Santo with May, not sure if the jet ski could handle the extra weight. The screams of the others on the boat died away as we moved away. It took several days to talk to the local police and the Greek Coast Guard. At first I was looked at as a suspect, but as details came in, that view changed and many considered me a hero, saving at least one person. I explained to them that I had woken up to the sound of a boat leaving the dock. I had no way to contact them, so I watched through binoculars. When I saw the first signs of fire, I followed them on a jet ski. My hope was to help them put out the engine fire. Once I got there, there was no chance of saving Hermes V or using her as a means of escape. Fortunately, both Lydia and Grigos confirmed that I had warned about the dangers of a broken boat. All my actions were confirmed by the Coast Guard and local authorities. There were no criminal charges. It was considered a tragedy. Many months later, I could not believe it. So much has happened, some of it bad. But this news was different. They were so good. I was going to become a father. My wife was pregnant. Finally, my life seemed to be going in the right direction, and now this news. I was delighted. But I guess I should go back and fill in some of the details of this story. The following Monday, after the tragedy at Hermes V, Lydia called a meeting of the spa staff. This included me. I didn't plan what would happen next in my life. I just assumed that I would be relieved of my duties at the spa. Despite the humiliation and negative experiences in Santo, after deep reflection, I realized that I loved living here and I really didn't want to leave. At the meeting, Lydia's message to staff was, regardless of the circumstances befalling Mr. Kanakis, work will continue as usual until further notice. We continued our normal routine, and I still met with Lydia in the mornings as usual and completed whatever projects were required for that day. I continued to receive my small salary, which was automatically transferred to my bank account. Suddenly, in the middle of the spa renovation, I remembered a message that I had a registered letter from the mainland. I was curious what it could be. I agreed with Lydia to take Friday afternoon off. I took the midday ferry from Santo to the mainland at Marnazes. We arrived around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I headed to the post office. I opened my mailbox, and there was only one letter. Registered letter with return address Trans-Pacific Financial. As I opened the envelope, I began to realize what it probably was. And I was right, it was a check. Big check. They must have sold the Samish Meadows property, and here's my share. $533,854. Suddenly, I had several options. Life on Santosh returned to something that could be called normal. Gradually, I started going to the tavern on weekends again. Strangely, I never saw John or Eve there again. They seemed like such familiar visitors, but besides them, there were all the same people there. I found some comfort in this familiar environment. Over time, I noticed that business at the spa began to slow down. Fewer people, less work for me and Grigos. Rumors began to spread. Was the spa on the verge of closing? I began to think about my options. Even though I loved life in Santosh, I didn't have a long-term career here. I began to think about returning to the USA. I even started researching different franchises to buy. It was the equivalent of buying yourself a job. Some options looked interesting, and I definitely had the money for it. But I was not ready to leave this beautiful island. Business at the spa continued to slow. Apart from Lydia, there was no leadership. Some spa staff started to leave. There were fewer guests and much less work. One afternoon, I was sitting in a store doing nothing. Grigos entered. "Devin, will you help my aunt fix the door?" After some thought, I agreed. Grigos and I took an old store truck and drove to the village to visit his elderly aunt. She showed me the problem. The hinges were loose and the door would not close properly. With Grigos' help, we fixed the door and it began to close. Aunt Lena gave me a pie as compensation. I told her there was no need, but she insisted. The pie was amazing. It started out slow at first, but then I started getting more requests for help. First from the locals of Santosh, and then gradually from wealthy European holidaymakers who own second homes on Santosh. One day, after renovating one of the holiday homes, Grigos said to me, "Devin, rich Europeans have a lot of money. You need to charge more." I quickly realized the economics of this situation. Locals paid what they could, but tourists paid full price and didn't seem to mind. Grigos and I soon started a small side business, and that was helpful. Business at the spa was drying up. Grigos and I did the necessary work at the spa, but spent most of our time doing side jobs. I met with Lydia one morning, and she told me that the spa was closing, and she was moving back to Athens by the end of the week. "Does this mean I need to move out of my apartment?" I asked. "I don't know," Lydia answered. "Probably not right away." By this time, Grigos and I were making more money from our side business than we were from the spa. I had, at least temporarily, a place to live and money in my account. The next day, I received notification of another registered letter in the mailbox in Manas. That same day, I took the ferry to the mainland. When I got there, it was another letter from Trans-Pacific. I half expected some kind of demand to return their original check, but it wasn't him. This time, it was another check for $328,212. It said, "Final compensation." What? Final compensation for what? I thought. Wow, I'm almost a millionaire. I thought as I left the bank. On the ferry ride back, I read the English version of the local newspaper. Everything was pretty boring, and suddenly I saw something that caught my attention. Auction to sell Santosh Spa for debts. Facilities belonging to the spa were listed there. With so many European tourists buying holiday homes on Santosh, the spa would sell for millions, I thought. I noticed that the auction was scheduled for next Saturday at noon, and there was an address listed in Marnes. I guess I'll need to start figuring out what to do and getting ready to move. On Friday evening, I went to a tavern. I sat down with a group of locals, and the conversation turned to the topic of the spa auction. "The auction is tomorrow at the City Hall at 12 o'clock, one of the men said. "No," I said, "he's on the mainland." "No, at City Hall." The man shook his head from side to side. "My wife's cousin's husband works there. It's in the city." I thought as I walked home, the information in the local newspaper must be wrong or something has changed. Typical Greek confusion. I decided to go into town tomorrow and check out the auction. The next day, on the square, I expected a huge crowd of auction participants. But instead, there was only a small group of people wandering around in one corner of the square. Most people were probably on the mainland. When I looked into the auction information, I saw that the property was divided into lots. Villa Kanakis was the main site. The spa area was listed as a possibility for a hotel restaurant, several other small plots of land, and then I saw it. It was described as a multi-use site. This included my small apartment. This was getting interesting. First, Kanakis' property was sold. This was the main prize. Several representatives fought for him. It went for almost 5 million euros. Next was the spa section. It was much larger, with many guest rooms. He went for just over 8 million. After this, most of the participants left. When it came to my apartment, the bidding started at 250,000 euros. There were several participants, but when the price reached 300,000, only me and one more person, some European, remained. I won 380,000, which included the store, its contents, and an old pickup truck. I was delighted. I became the owner of property in Santosh. By that time, the remaining few plots were almost empty of people. I almost left, but then I studied the map. Is it possible? I checked the zoning. It was classified as commercial. The initial bid for this plot was 200,000 euros. Nobody raised the price. Commercial land was not as valuable as residential land. I offered 205,000. No one else bid. I now own a second piece of land. All of this, I had to believe, happened because the auction information was mixed up due to typical bureaucratic incompetence. I calculated that the land was adjacent to the same secret cove that I had discovered. Yes, the same bay where Gabrielle and I swam naked. The thought was like a knife wound. I tried to block this memory. I was wondering if it would be possible to change the zoning of the land from commercial to residential. I've just finished building my fourth and final beach cottage, which I've named Côte d'Azur. It took a lot of work, luck, and insight to get to this point. I remembered. After the auction the following week, I went straight to the local office to inquire about changing the zoning to residential for the bayfront land. I was told no. I tried twice more, but the local magistrate was adamant. After the third try, I was quite frustrated. On my way back to the apartment, I ran into Grigos. He sensed my mood. "Boss," that's what he called me now. "Why do you look so sad?" he asked. I explained to him my frustrations with the zoning. Grigos, a kind and funny man, but certainly not a Rhodes Scholar, looked at me, absorbing my words. "Don't worry, boss," he told me. "I can help." I simply nodded, not believing that the situation would change. 3 days later, Grigos knocked on my door. "Boss, I need 1,000 euros, he told me. "Loan?" I asked him. No, for zoning." He seemed slightly annoyed at my lack of understanding. I had an old metal box with money under my bed. I gave Grigos 1,000. I had no confidence that anything would change. We continued to do renovations mainly for wealthy European holidaymakers. I almost forgot about the money I gave Grigos. The following Monday, Grigos came running up to me with a huge smile on his face. He waved the document in his hand. Boss, the zoning has changed," he joyfully told me, handing over the document. It was hard to make out, but I understood what he was saying. Somehow Grigos managed to change the zoning to residential. With a little work, this area could be turned into 4 lots, costing a ton of money. My life, already changing in a positive direction, became even better. "How did you manage to do this?" I asked Grigos, still not believing that my simple friend pulled it off. "My uncle's neighbor, his daughter, is married to a magistrate. The car needed to be fixed," he told me. I absorbed this information. It was easy to conclude. All it took was the right bribe at the right time. Grigos did it. "Thank you," I simply told him. This fourth and final cottage by the bay was the best. I learned and improved with every build. Now there were 4 separate cottages on the shore of a small, almost pirate bay. I sold my first cottage too cheap to an elderly Italian woman. She appreciated it and lived in Santosh all year round. She vowed never to leave. The second one I raised the price significantly, but it also sold immediately. I thought it would be worth asking for even more. It was bought by two American male millionaires from the technology industry. The third was bought by an elderly German industrialist, his much younger wife, and he spent several months at a time in Santosh. I asked for much more for this cottage, and I got what I wanted. The last cottage was the best. I was planning on moving there with my growing family, but had interest from someone who expressed interest. During our email correspondence, they hinted that money was not an issue for the deal. I set what seemed to me an absurdly high price, and he still insisted on meeting. He and his wife wanted to meet this Saturday. I decided to at least meet with a potential buyer and consider my options. For the price we talked about, I could live very comfortably in retirement. When they first approached, I didn't recognize her. She held his hand as they walked towards me. Her hair was different, and she was wearing sunglasses, but then I heard her voice. There was no doubt. It was Gabrielle. I haven't had any news of her since the Hermes accident, other than that she survived. I can't say I never thought about her, but over time many of those thoughts faded away. I studied with her husband, who is 10 years older than her. About 40, good-looking. He made his money the old-fashioned way, inherited them. His father invested in low-cost residential real estate. In other words, he was a slumlord. My husband extended his hand in greeting. Gabrielle still didn't recognize me. Danislas Zenidas, he smiled when we shook hands. This is my wife, Gabri. Is that you, Devon? Gabrielle interrupted her husband, looking at me. I stood silently, not saying a word. Gabrielle hugged me, my arms remaining woodenly pinned to my sides. Do you know each other? Zenidas asked, smiling but confused. Oh yeah, Gabrielle replied. Devon and I met a while ago and spent one summer together. We had fun. My face remained indifferent, but inside my emotions were seething. We had fun. It certainly wouldn't end in what I would call fun. Would you like to see the cottage? I asked, changing the subject. Gabrielle looked at me with furrowed brows, noting my lack of warmth upon meeting me. We toured the cottage, and I pointed out all the features. Gabrielle and her husband seemed impressed and very interested. The view was amazing. Zenidas asked to see access to the beach. I built an accessible path down to the bay. When we got to the sand, Gabrielle took off her shoes, and we all walked down to the water. I remember this beach, Gabrielle said with a slight smile towards me. Personal memory. I ignored her, turned to Zenidas, and said I would return to the cottage. A few minutes later, they returned to the house with big smiles on their faces. Devon, Zenidas began, we are interested. It will be a wonderful addition to our main house in Athens and apartment in Paris. Oh, Danny, Gabrielle said enthusiastically, I love this house. I really want him. Her gaze slid from her husband to me. She was charming, there was no doubt about it, but I knew the real person underneath the pretty exterior. I knew she couldn't be trusted and wondered how long Zenidas would last. We are staying on the south coast tonight, Zenidas said. I can contact my lawyer later today and offer you terms tomorrow. Why don't we meet here at noon? I nodded. Before they left, Gabrielle tried to hug me again, but I barely returned her hug. As they walked down the path, I heard her shouting in delight about the cottage and the beauty of the beach. That evening, my wife and I had a long discussion about our home, our finances, our unborn child, and the life we wanted to live together. By the end of the evening, I had made my final decision. The next day, I was at the Bay House early installing hardware on the kitchen cabinets. I was almost done when I heard their voices coming up the path to the house. They entered the cottage, Zenidas carrying a briefcase and Gabrielle holding a bottle of champagne. Both looked very pleased. Zenidas shook my hand and Gabrielle tried to hug me again. Same reaction as before. Gabrielle immediately began to speak. We can put a white sofa here and paint this wall light green. She listed all the improvements she planned. As you can see, Zenidas said, opening his briefcase and taking out documents, here is the agreed price and instructions for transferring money from my bank. If you or your representative provide bank details. I have decided not to sell. I interrupted Zenidas with an impassive expression on my face, ignoring Gabrielle. There was silence for a moment, confusion, as if they had misunderstood what I had said. "I don't understand," said Zenidas. "Yesterday we had an agreement in principle. I don't quite understand what happened." "Mr. Zenidas, I never agreed to sell the property," I began. "After deep thought and discussion with my wife, we have decided to move here and raise our family here." "Danny," Gabrielle said capriciously, "do something. I want this house on the beach." "Devin, I'm willing to raise the price. Let's be reasonable," said Zenidas, starting to get angry. "Sorry," I replied coldly. "The property is no longer for sale." "But I want this house," Gabrielle screamed, clearly accustomed to getting everything her own way. I turned to her. She was beautiful, no doubt, but the version of her I saw now was becoming less and less attractive. "You know, Gabrielle," I said, "I was told something once, and I have to rephrase it, but it went something like this. Sometimes in life we don't always get what we want. That's one of life's greatest lessons." She stared at me. I wasn't sure if she remembered saying that to me, but it seemed to me that he remembered. Suddenly, she turned away. "Let's go," she ordered Zenidas. Quietly, he collected his papers, nodded briefly to me, and followed Gabrielle down the path. I shouted after them, "You forgot your champagne." I thought I heard someone quietly say, "Leave it alone." And then a much louder female voice shouted, "Go to hell." I couldn't help but smile. I later realized that after that encounter, the demons of my experience with Gabrielle began to disappear completely. It certainly helped that my life was pretty good. I will soon become a father. We will live in a beautiful cottage on the beach that I built. I had enough money and a small business that provided for us in good style. And of course, I had my wife, Maria. After my initial covert rejection of Maria that night in the tavern, I felt bad. At first, Maria, Gina, and some other locals ignored me. In an attempt to apologize, I made a habit of buying their group drinks. Gradually, their attitude towards me began to change. To some extent, the events surrounding Kanakis' humiliation of me began to leak out. For some time, I did not visit the tavern at all. Eventually, I returned. One evening, Gina, with whom I worked at the spa, invited me to sit with them, looking up from my secluded spot at the bar. Maria and I started communicating. At first, I described Maria as attractive, but a little ordinary. But the more I got to know her, the more the warmth of her personality made her more attractive to me. We started seeing each other more often and eventually got married. This is perhaps another story for another time. Immediately after Kanakis, my ex-father-in-law, and Gabriel enjoyed humiliating me, I had serious mental outbursts. I couldn't sleep at night thinking about my own worth. It was never as bad as that first morning with the gun, but there were difficult moments. This pain is now gone. Time passed and Maria and I lived in our beautiful house by the bay. We have 2 wonderful daughters, and Maria is now pregnant with our 3rd child. Grigos and his wife moved into my old apartment. I charge him minimum rent, and he and Maria's brother, Nick, run a construction company. This is probably the end of this story, but there is one last thing that I keep thinking about. I still remember Kanakis saying that there are times in life when we are no longer in control of our destiny. I agree with that, but there are also times when we are in control. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. 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 Click to the next one.